Welcome back to Better with Context. I'm Joe McNamara of Joe McNamara Consulting, and today we're diving into something that keeps so many creators, entrepreneurs, and business owners up at night. And that is, why is it so damn hard to stay consistent with content creation? For starters, if you've ever started a blog or launched some kind of social media strategy, or maybe you just promised yourself, hey, I'm going to post regularly, only to find yourself like 2-3 weeks later staring at a blank screen and essentially just trying to figure out what happened to your motivation, then this episode is for you. We're going to unpack the real reasons behind content hesitation. We'll explore some things related to the psychology that trips us up. And most importantly, I'm going to try and give you a framework to finally break through these barriers and get it so that content just becomes as natural as anything else that you do with repetition in your life. But for starters, let's kind of talk through the psychology of content paralysis, which in itself is actually a real thing. Most people think that consistency issues are about time management or in some cases, having ideas or the lack of ideas. But after kind of working with hundreds of content creators over the years, the real culprit actually runs much deeper. The first thing that, as I was kind of putting my thoughts together, that I wanted to talk about this morning is the perfectionism trap, right? And what I mean by that is, we've all been conditioned to just believe that every single piece of content needs to be some form of a masterpiece. A lot of that has to do with the fact that, we scroll through super polished Instagram feeds or we read these viral LinkedIn posts. And when we compare those to our rough drafts, a lot of times we kind of come up short. But the truth is perfectionism isn't about high standards. It's actually about fear. You have that fear of judgment and you have fear of criticism or just not being good enough. And when you compare that to, the examples that you see or that you're inundated with on a daily basis, it's really difficult to get over that hump. But, one of the things that really eats at us is when you try to perfect these things, it actually becomes the enemy of consistency. And the biggest reason is because you just essentially set the bar impossibly high. So all of this effort, all of this work that you've gone through to essentially create your content will never be good enough and will never see the light of day. And as such, like your consistency will suffer. A lot of this thinking assumes that the only value will come from being the absolute best or most knowledgeable person in your field. I have these conversations a lot too where, I'll say, well, that sounds like an interesting anecdote or that sounds like a really cool piece of experience. Why don't you share that with your audience? And a lot of times I either get blank stares or I get folks that are genuinely concerned and saying, well, I'm not an expert. When I look around, I'm not at the level of the folks that I'm following. And to that, my response is kind of twofold. Number one, everybody's on their own path and everybody goes at a different pace. They're at a different point in their journey. For those of you that are out there that are young, aspirational professionals or entrepreneurs or solopreneurs or whatever you may, be chasing, it's okay to acknowledge that, hey, I'm young. There's a lot of experience. There's just a lot of things I don't know because I don't know. But I don't think that should necessarily be a barrier for you to share your experience, to kind of what I've advised other folks in the past is to build in public, build out loud and to show and invite your network, invite your audience to experience the highs and the lows associated with whatever those those content opportunities are, or those big aspirational projects. Bring us along for the ride. And that kind of leads us into the second piece of the psychology of content paralysis, and that's really the authority complex. And this is the voice in your head that says, who am I to talk about this? There's already experts in this space. What could I possibly add? And again, this thinking assumes that, the value only comes from being the absolute best in your field. But that's really not how content works. In a lot of ways, what we're seeing, it should come as no shock to anybody, but like the more genuine and transparent and just real that you can be with your audience, the more they're going to reward you with their attention, with their engagement, and ultimately with their trust. I mean, you think about it, at the end of the day, regardless of whether you're in B2C or B2B or some other, form of that combination, you're still selling to people and people are still buying from people. It may be, and again, it's not to put down the equity that these brands build, and certainly not to put down the work that should go into building your own brand equity. But at the end of the day, people don't just buy stuff because the brand is there. For the important purchases in life, people still want to work with other people. And I think that is something that is innately just derived from what I would consider just the human condition in really being conditioned to be social and to want to interact with another human being on the other end of a transaction. But, at the end of the day, your unique perspective, as well as your specific audience and your particular way of explaining things is where the value lies. And that gets, again, back to that genuine approach. The other piece, too, is this concept of like the invisible audience syndrome. And, that is, so like you imagine that there's this massive judgmental crowd just watching your every move. And this is not to downplay, like there are real risks and sometimes, emotional dangers related to, online, content. We have our keyboard warriors out there but at the end of the day, like if you're genuinely building your audience and you're coming from a position of, honesty and transparency, again, those kind of signals that you put out are going to be the types of folks that you attract. And so in a lot of ways, like you don't need to be as hesitant that, there's going to be this judgmental crowd on the other side of the screen just watching your every move. In reality, when you're starting out, the biggest challenge isn't really the harsh criticism. It's just getting anyone to notice you. And that's a big challenge, right? A lot of folks just expect, and we'll get into this in a bit, but, expect that every piece of content that they create needs to go viral because it's the only way that they're going to survive because there's so many other people out here doing exactly what I do. But I would argue on the flip side, there's also plenty of anecdotal evidence that just because somebody else is in the space doing the exact same thing doesn't necessarily mean that you can't compete. I mean, you look across multiple industries, there's a reason that there's more than one tire company or more than one computer company or, you name your industry, but ultimately, you have to be confident and you have to believe in your why long before you ever get anyone in your audience to believe it. And that needs to kind of come through in the content that you create. Again, the more genuine and honest and transparent you can be, the more resonant that content's going to be for your audience. So, from a psychological perspective, those are kind of the areas that I've seen really hinder a lot of folks from just being more consistent. But there's also a practical side. Even when we overcome the mental barriers, there are real tangible challenges that can also, derail our content consistency too. I think the first concept is like this hamster wheel, where many people just approach content creation like they're feeding their dog. And they think that they just need fresh, original ideas every single day. And this is kind of what creates, again, like this hamster wheel concept where you're just running constantly, but you're not really going anywhere. And the solution isn't really more ideas, but it's a better system for developing. And here's the kicker, repurposing the ideas you already have. And this gets back again to like, the confidence or the lack of confidence when it comes to, folks that saying, well, I'm not an expert in this field. Like I see all these other people talking about these things and they're all over, they talk about all of this stuff. And I advise my clients, you know what are the 3 things that you'd be comfortable enough to talk to anybody about? If you had 5 minutes at the end of a bar, what would you talk to them about? Or if you had 25 minutes and you were presenting, like, what would you talk about? And rather than trying to get them to, format and just formulate like these really polished versions, a lot of times what I'll do is just say, hey, why don't we jump on a call? Let's jump on a call and we're going to record our conversation. And within this conversation, I'm going to have some softball questions for you that will feel like softballs because they're going to be questions directly related to those, 2 to 3 things that you're really comfortable talking about. And then let's see how many different ways can we repurpose and repackage and reutilize the insights and the value that come from this recorded conversation in a meaningful way that your audience is going to find value in. I guess another practical roadblock is kind of this all or nothing mentality. And this is one that I see pretty frequently too. And that's where someone decides that they're going to post every day. They're going to write 2,000 word blog posts or maintain 5 different platforms simultaneously. And, they're going to take this checklist approach in that, hey, I did it. I shipped it. It's out. I've met my daily quota for the day. There's a couple reasons why that's not necessarily the most optimized usage of your time. But I think one of the other areas that kind of pops up is like life inevitably gets busy. And when that happens, then your entire system will collapse. And again, consistency is not about perfection. It's about sustainability. And so if you've got a mediocre plan, no offense, but if you've got a mediocre plan you can stick to, it will beat the hell out of a perfectioned or a perfected plan that you abandon 2 weeks in. Overall, there's not necessarily anything innately wrong with challenging yourself and throwing down the gauntlet and saying, hey, I'm going to do all of this on a daily basis. And part of it is just trying to figure out, can I? But, the other piece of it too that I feel like a lot of people make in terms of mistakes is like the platform overcommitment, where they're trying to be everywhere at once, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, write a blog, continuously, update a newsletter. And what ends up happening inevitably is they end up spreading themselves so thin that nothing really gets the attention that it deserves. And rather than, just focusing on 1, maybe 2 outlets and really optimizing that for a growing audience, you're just trying to be everything to everybody. And in reality, you're nobody to anyone. Might have to coin that phrase. But again, when I look around, the most successful content creators I know really dominate one platform and they figure out how to optimize what they're doing. They build their processes and then they look at opportunities to expand to other platforms or in some cases build out additional processes. So yeah, those are kind of the 2 pieces. The third that I was kind of thinking through is just the overall content strategy. And this is more of a solution. So, like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to do my best to try and share a framework that's really helped, dozens of my clients move from sporadic kind of shotgun approach to marketing, throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks, into a more consistent strategic, content creation strategy. And the first step is to really identify and build out your content core. So before you create a single piece of content, you need to define what your content core is. And in my opinion, this consists of 3 major elements. The first is your primary audience. It's not everyone who might be interested, but really sitting down and putting in the work to define a specific person you're trying to help. I think George Thomas actually makes a brilliant point when he says, I've got this opportunity to impact thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people. But when I think about whether my efforts are successful, I really measure it through, have I helped a person? Did what I did help someone do something better, understand how to perform at a higher level? And if the answer is yes, then it's been a success. And so if we were going to extrapolate that and kind of apply it here, again, what I would say is do your due diligence and take the time to really build out what your ideal customer profile looks like, what your buyer persona looks like, but take it a step further and really look at it through the psychological lens and say, how could I help this person? How could my content help them, solve a challenge that keeps them up at night, or, help them in their day-to-day, kind of administrative duties, right? Like there's a million different scenarios that you can throw in here, but ultimately it's really about, honing in on your primary audience. The second is probably equally as important, and that's your unique angle. What's your specific take or approach that sets you apart? And this gets back to what we were talking about before, right? Like, just because there are other players in the space doesn't mean that everyone attacks the same challenges the exact same way. And in a lot of ways, if you can combine the first piece of this and how to be helpful with the second piece of this of being genuinely, approachful in how you set about solving issues, what you'll find is there will be some natural differentiation between you and your competition. Now, I wouldn't necessarily look at it through the lens of how can I compete or how can I differentiate myself. But again, it's what's the most unique and yet most valuable approach that I can take that's also going to reward my audience with the value add and the help that I'm trying to deliver to them. And that flows directly into the third piece, and that's your core message. So, and you will find this, there are people that will consume every piece of content that you ever create. And in some cases, you'll never know that they do. At least you won't for a long time. But if someone consumed every piece of your content, the question you should ask is, what's the main transformation or insight that they'd walk away with? And again, is this a day-to-day, put this in your pocket and go apply it to your workflow? Or is this more of a strategic, insight in terms of, hey, if you're not thinking about this through this lens, you should start, because there are people that around you that are already on this path. And this is really important when it comes to, never stagnating as a professional and being able to deliver those kinds of insights within the sphere of influence that you're building as a creator is extremely impactful for your audience. That first content core step leads into the second piece, and that's really your content pillar system. So instead of hunting for new topics every week, instead try and identify, again, like maybe 2 to 3, I've seen it, folks go up to 5, specific pillars. And these are, in themselves broad themes that align with your expertise, but are also coupled with your audience needs. As an example, if you're a productivity coach, your pillars might look something like time management techniques, or, mindset and motivation, tools and systems that can help you accomplish what you're trying to do, while also doing something like work-life balance systems, and setting goals and recognizing achievements, right? Like, every piece of content that you build as a productivity coach should fit into one of these pillars. And this gets into a more strategic approach overall that I advise all of my clients, and that is, don't just do marketing to do marketing. You should really be looking at it through the lens of, if I owned this company and my main purpose for the day was to be the marketer, what am I going to build that is most likely to have the biggest impact and most aligned with the overall organization's directional, growth? This gets you out of the mindset of just marketing to market. Hey, shiny stuff is cool, slick stuff is cool. Designers out there, this is not meant to offend, but at the end of the day, like, if you have done your due diligence and you really know your audience, then you're also going to know that, insights will beat, a flashy one-pager every time. But if you can couple those together, then you've got an even more optimized product. So it's not an either or, but it's really about making sure that you keep your customer at the center of what you're doing, and then drive towards the organizational goals that are kind of put down by your leadership. Or, again, if you're an entrepreneur, like, what are you trying to accomplish with your organization? So those are kind of the first two steps. And then the third one is just really the batch and bank, or the batch library model, which is where I see a lot of folks kind of get it wrong. They create content in real time. It puts enormous pressure on every individual post because, again, you've looked at it through the lens of one and done. We're going to use this one time, and then we need something fresh. But instead, what I would recommend is to set aside like dedicated time for content creation. And it's a little bit different for everybody. But normally, the 2 to 4 hour window once a week is normally pretty successful for most of my clients. And again, during this time, you're really going to want to look at how to create multiple pieces of content at once. And a lot of it's just trying to enter and stay within that creative flow state and then be able to leverage it. So it's very difficult to start, stop throughout the week and just essentially schedule time and say, all right, I've got 15 minutes to be super insightful, and then I got to go move on and do something else. And I'll come back to this, and I'll work on it throughout the week. In most cases, human beings have been found to be terrible multitaskers, and as such, like, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to jump around. But again, everybody's creative process is a little different. The key here is just when you're in that creative flow is literally just to optimize it and take full advantage of it, in really trying to, make the most of it. And again, when you can leverage that creative flow state and you're in that, build stage, bank that kind of content so that you're always working ahead and you're never scrambling to post something last minute. I've read insights on both sides of the spectrum, but I found super fascinating that there are still folks that, even though there are opportunities to completely automate their social presence, they opt for, sitting down, going through their creative process, coming up with, 5 to 10 topics, building out those assets, and then challenging themselves to, they're going to post every day, but now they're working from a library rather than trying to work off the top of the dome. And as such, you allow yourself the opportunity to customize what you're doing. The posting itself on a day-to-day, that can take you 2-3 minutes. So it's not a ton of time allocated away from some of the other, driving priorities that you have, but it still gives you the opportunity to stay in full control of your creative process and your ultimate delivery of, your content to your audience. So I lied. There's one more step. And that is the repurpose and multiply strategy. So building on the batch and bank model, one great idea can truly become 5 to 10 pieces of additional content across different formats, different mediums, and delivered through different vehicles. Like, here's an example. If you were going to write a single blog post, you could take that blog post, and in itself is an asset on its own. But then you could take that blog post and create social media posts that highlight the key points within your blog post. So depending on how long it is and how many key points you have anywhere from one additional social post all the way through however many, like 5 or 10 or whatever you may have. The other thing you can do, and especially with the continued progression of LLMs, is like, take your blog post and feed it into an LLM and come up with a podcast episode that allows you to expand on the topic. A lot of times, and this is not for everybody, but a lot of times I find, like right now, I'm able to deliver a lot more insights in an audio version than I'm going to be by able to sit down and typing through. I'm a pretty good, typist, but, ultimately this is more of a free flow state for me where I can deliver a ton of insights, and then I'll actually reverse this. So I start with a podcast, and then I'll take that and transcribe it. I'll take that transcription and turn it into an outline for a companion article. I'll take that transcript and find, specific, quote call outs that I can turn into quote cards for social media. I'm going to take that transcript and I might, come up with a series of, designs or infographics that fit well within my social strategy too. And all it took me, I know we're 20 something minutes in, but it's a hell of a lot easier than trying to sit and struggle through, typing out 1,500, 2,000 words, which again, we're not even sure anymore, how impactful long form, blog posts are. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be. And again, it gets back to what you understand about your audience. I know my audience, and hopefully the ones that are listening, they prefer insights over, any kind of APA documentation or formatting or things like that. Okay, so I think that's where I'm going to end for today. This is most likely going to turn into a two-parter, at least, just based on the remaining notes that I have. But, I hope that, what I've shared with you today can at least start to help you unlock a little bit more consistency when it comes to your content creation process. And at the same time, I hope that, I'll be able to unlock just as much value in terms of my content creation process and how I follow through based on what I'm creating. So for those of you out there that are listening to this, I really appreciate it. Open call too, in terms of topics, things that you want to hear about. This will be coming back more consistently. Speaking of which, I'm going to, essentially eat my own dog food here, and be more consistent with these episodes because I feel like there's a lot to talk about and I feel like there's a ton of value here. And in some cases, hopefully this is an opportunity for current clients, past clients, and future clients to get a better snapshot or insight into some of the value that Joe McNamara Consulting can bring. So thank you all, and I will see you for our next episode.